Thank you very much. And I think I can invite Linus Pfeiffer, who is going to talk about German experience. Thank you very much.
Ja, habe ich geschickt. Ja. A colleague from the DIW had some research that said that the rent increases at least for 7 cents within 250 meters distance. So that's quite a lot when we consider that in some neighborhoods we have a very high Airbnb density, and research from other areas and other cities also goes in the same direction, which says that there's a connection between rent increase and the density of short-term rentals. So in this map, I want to show that some of the neighborhoods with the strongest rent increases in Berlin have been also those neighborhoods that have very high Airbnb density. The maps are not the same. One is postal codes and one is like a different area that we use in Berlin, the LOR. And we can see that in the northern parts of Neukölln, especially, those have been faced by very high rent increases, and they also have the highest Airbnb densities in the city. These are just the 10 postal codes that had the highest rent increase. So there is some spatial connection as well. Then I brought this quote from Brian Chesky, who's the founder of Airbnb. "The office as we know it is over," he said in an interview in Time magazine. And why I bring up this quote is that now with the COVID pandemic, we've seen the emergence of remote work, let's say, and this phenomenon of digital nomadism. So the differentiation between short-term rentals and long-term rentals in the future might not be as separated as we know it as of now. And more and more people work in services, have jobs in technology. So Airbnb or short-term rentals might be also home for some people, and the number of people that are affected by this might also increase. So to conclude, the impact of short-term rentals on housing supply and rent has been established by research. There's a strong interdependence of the two markets where when we have rent control, also the incentive to let short-term increases. And also we have this impact of short-term rentals on the rent. So the two markets, or if there even are two markets, are very connected. And we have this phenomenon of remote working now. So I argue that when we talk about rent control, we also have to take short-term rentals into consideration. Yeah, the next question is, should short-term rentals be regulated? And this a delicate matter, because there might be some cases where regulation is not necessary. However, short-term rentals are connected to some externalities. I mentioned the impact on rents and housing prices, but then in other cities, not so much in Berlin. In Berlin, the discourse is very focused on the impact on rents, but in other cities, Barcelona, Amsterdam, we have this discourse about over-tourism and the externalities from noise, littering, uncivil behavior, and similar things. So these externality problems are a reason why in some cases short-term rentals should be regulated. And also Airbnb, due to their market share in many cities around the world and the inherent networks effects and economies of scale, is also a natural monopoly. And this might be also a reason to regulate the industry due to competition reasons. So now I want to come to the case of Berlin. This is the history of legislation in Berlin, summed up very shortly. So in 2013, the law on the prohibition of misuse of residential space, that's a very difficult translation, it's Zweckentfremdungsverbotgesetz in German, came into force in 2013 when the Berlin state government said we have a housing crisis here, and we have to stop this misuse of urban apartments. The law was enacted in May 2014, and many understood it as a de facto ban of short-term rentals, with the exception of hosted rentals. So if one wants to rent parts of their apartment, so less than 50%, this was still possible. However, you needed a permit from the Berlin government for unhosted rentals, and those were only for very rare reasons accepted, so like for economic hardship or similar cases. Then we had a transition period until May 2016, where the listings that were online before May 2014 were still permitted. But then after May 2016, it applied to all listings. Then also the court lawmaking played a role. In 2016, a court ruled that owners of secondary residences should be allowed to rent their property short-term. The whole ban was abolished by this court rule, and this was also a reason the Berlin Parliament passed an update to the law in August 2018, where they ended the de facto ban and put time limits for primary and secondary residences, 182 days. So the law says it has to remain the character of a primary residence, and courts understood this as less than half of the year, and for secondary residences up to 90 days. Then again, we had a court rule in June 2021 that forced Airbnb to give data to the authorities. That was also an important change, that you will see that later, because before Airbnb simply refused to share data. And in November 2021, we had a minor update that said that also commercial spaces have to display a registration number. So now I want to talk about the methodology of my research very briefly. I used the methodology called Leximetrics, which is a quantification of legislation where you have certain variables quantify it by putting a number for each variable. I will show that later. And the approach is quite similar to a work by Kolodilin, which did a similar thing for housing legislation in general. And to my knowledge, is the first comprehensive indicator for short-term rental legislation. So these are the variables. I compared, or I also looked at regulation in other cities, mainly Paris, Amsterdam, and Barcelona, and collected all the relevant legislation that is there, and then for Berlin constructed this indicator where we have all these variables, and it takes the value 1 if this law is in place. And so a higher value means a stricter regulation of the short-term rental market. And the last 4 variables are also differentiated between rental types. Primary residences, secondary residences, and unhosted rentals, because most of the laws differentiate between those types. So the findings. Here you can see the number of listings, and highlighted with the vertical lines are the policy changes. So the end of the transition period in May 2016, you can see a drop in the listings. I forgot to put that the orange line is all listings, and the green line would be whole apartments, because on Airbnb you can also rent just shared rooms, for example. And then we see that with the policy changes, there's always a drop in the number of listings. However, the number increases after. This is for the Berlin districts, where we can see that this drop in numbers was mostly caused by the central districts or neighborhoods of Berlin, mainly Friedrichshain-Kreuzberg and also Mitte, very, very relevant. This is the impact on availability. This is average availability for the whole year. So before the legislation came into place, most of the listings were rented out for sometimes over 200 days a year. So we know that these apartments were taken off of the long-term market, and the legislation had quite an impact on the availability. This is a graph of the share of listings that display a registration number. This was mandatory after the update of August 2018. And even though the listings legally were required to display a registration number, we see that this was done very rarely. And also I calculated the share of commercial listings. So commercial listings are defined as multi-listings, so a host that owns more than one listing, and also listings that are rented out for more than 90 days a year. And we see that this share is quite big. So when we look at the legislation, we see that the majority of the listings are illegal in Berlin, and that there's almost no law enforcement. And then I come to the regression, where I estimated a fixed effects model with the indicator I presented to you, the short-term regulation index. And you can see that the regulation actually had an impact on the number of listings. The impact is highly significant. And I also included other variables, the number of tourists, which is guests, the COVID incidence, because the COVID pandemic and traveling restrictions also had an impact on the market. And what is also interesting is the first generation rent control Mietendeckel that we had in Berlin, which basically froze all rents for 1 year, but then was outlawed by a court rule, had a positive impact on the number of listings. So as the possibilities to create revenue with long-term rentals decrease, we see an increase in the number of short-term rentals, which is quite interesting, I think. So to conclude very briefly, I offered 6 policy recommendations in my thesis. The first one would be to make platforms accountable, to also share data and enforce the relevant legislation that hasn't been done in the past often. The second policy recommendation is to allow genuine home sharing, where apartments remain part of the long-term market and are a home, and to disincentivize commercial short-term rentals. This could be done with taxes or a day limit for rentals. The third recommendation would be to limit the number of permits in certain neighborhoods. You could also make them tradable to ensure efficiency. And this is mainly because this way the law enforcement would be much more effective, and we wouldn't have the situation where we have a law, but almost all of the listings don't follow the rules. Then I say to differentiate between different zones in the city, because the impact and the distribution of short-term rentals is very heterogeneous across the city. And putting different measures to different zones could be very beneficial, also because one of the main benefits of short-term rentals was this decentralization of tourism in the beginning. And to really benefit from that, some laws should address this maybe. Then platforms should be taxed efficiently. There are some reports that the relevant taxes are almost never paid in this market. And to conclude, I recommend to do a data-driven policy, and to also take advantage of the data that is readily available. And it seems that this hasn't always been the case. And district council, for example, weren't aware that so many listings are still illegal in Berlin. So the references, I haven't have them in there. Thank you for your patience, and and if there are any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thanks a lot. I have one question. Okay, so apparently we have to, if we want to ask questions, we have to ask them here. So it's you mentioned that you did it for a couple of other cities like Amsterdam, Barcelona, and Paris. So it would be interesting to see, or can you say a few words about the intensity of regulations in these cities compared to Berlin, where the intensity is higher? And it would be just one suggestion to your estimation approach. So you are estimating the averages of or total numbers of listings for each district of Berlin.
Yes.
Okay. So in that case, you may also have you can also use the apart from the incidences of COVID, you can use this Oxford sanitary measures stringency index, which shows how many lockdowns and other measures have been in place in each particular moment of time. And maybe it makes sense to take into account the dynamics of the market, because these platforms, they are competing with each other. Airbnb is not the only one. In Germany, you have a couple of others, and the changes in the number of listings can also have to do with this competition and with the entrance in the market. Okay, 2000, I don't know when Airbnb first started to operate in German market, but apparently in the beginning you have a phase of expansion that can be also taken into account.
Thank you. I wasn't aware of this Oxford database for the lockdowns. About the regulation in other cities. So Berlin was among the cities with the strictest regulation. We had some interesting policies also in the other cities. For example, Barcelona outlaws unhosted rentals completely, which in my opinion does not make that much sense, because the unhosted rentals are actually those that benefit the local neighborhood because they have an additional income, and the apartment theoretically remains on the long-term market. In Amsterdam, interestingly, also in New Orleans, I think this was the case, we had a ban for certain neighborhoods where, for the old quarter in Amsterdam, Airbnbs weren't allowed at all. However, this was also outlawed by a court rule. Sometimes these regulations go too far, and then the courts take them back. In Paris, the regulation is not that strict. There's also a day limit for the rentals. And yes, what's the third thing about the data? And the other competitors in the market. Actually, the market share is very high in Berlin of Airbnb, and the reason why most of also the other studies don't take other platforms into consideration is because we have double listings sometimes, where one listing is offered on multiple platforms. There are even websites that offer to do this automatically. So to take other platforms into consideration might be even far away from the reality. But you are right that this is not the whole picture, just looking at one platform. Thank you.
Just was wondering about the interaction between the increased listings and the introduction of first-generation rent control. I mean, can you quantify this somehow? What the proportion? If you look at the new absorption after the introduction of these generation one rent controls, what proportion went into Airbnb? And then the general question is, I mean, can we show, if you look at different cities, right? Can we show this for other cities as well? I mean, one of the reasons why I guess we have Airbnb is not just a substitution of the tourism industry, but of course you have some rigidities like no supply in apartments, location, and so on, which you sometimes need for the long-term stay. But also it's a substitute for long-term rentals. So to what extent does the rent control regime, for example, I worked just in Portugal, and the rent control regime, I had to redo the indicator World Bank, which was low rent control to high rent control, because there was so much regulation that made it impossible to evict to raise rents and so on, differentiated by different types of tenants and so on. So, and you see that this one was a huge problem, right? And I guess it's the same in Barcelona, right? So the actions of local policymakers tend to be, in my empirical understanding, in proportion to the rigidity of the rent control regime. Is there anything you can say about this interaction?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not really able to quantify this because to quantify this, you would need like high good quality data on rents, and yeah, I only found that there is this highly significant impact of the during the Mietendeckel time, yeah, where we see 214. I guess with the how the regression is set up, it's not really that you can say how much the Mietendeckel actually how many listings then went to Airbnb. It would be very interesting to look at this, but unfortunately, yeah, due to limited resources and time constraint for a bachelor thesis, I wasn't able to do all of this. But yeah, what I argue is that the rent control, and especially strict rent control and yeah, short-term rentals really should be thought of together, and yeah, the legislation should be changed accordingly.
Maybe you can show us the graph.
Yeah, you can see the.
Yeah. So yeah, we had many things during this period. Also, there are the policy changes. Then there's the corona pandemic. We have changes in the overall rent legislation. So it's difficult to say, but yeah.
Increase following each event, right? You see an increase following each. These are specific rent control events for short-term rentals, right?
Yeah, the policy changes for short-term
rentals. The general rental market was 18.
Mm-hmm.
No, it was 2020. 20.
I think 20 years.
Yeah, it's still approximately 1 year to February or April 2021. It's a rent freeze that maybe you can show it to for those who are not familiar with Berlin's rent freeze.
The rent freeze?
No, I mean, on this map, you can show the material what was the rent freeze on the time scale.
I think, yeah, so 2020 around here, but this is also the time we had the COVID outbreak, so it's difficult, yeah, to say which had what impact. But it was around.
It was introduced 4 weeks before the outbreak or before the first lockdown in Germany, and then it ended in April 2021.
Yeah. So during this period, more or less.
It's of course how to capture the dominance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. It was very interesting. You briefly mentioned that first generation rent control was cancelled by the court. So maybe you could say a few more words. When did it happen? Who made the petition? Why was it cancelled?
Yeah, so we had this Mietendeckel, it was called. The rent lit is the translation. And yeah, the left government of Berlin introduced this first generational rent control, where in the first step, all the rents were frozen to a certain point in time, and then even in a second step, some of the rents.
What year did it happen? When?
2020. And yeah, in the second step, also some rents were actually decreased with that, and then yeah, the reason why the court changed this was that they say in Germany, as we are a federal state, the competence for rent legislation is on the overall nation level, and the German states are not allowed to interfere in the market like that. Yeah.
The same happened in Barcelona. I am in Catalonia like 8 months ago.
Ah, wow. Okay.
had a low rent increase, and they told us that it was unconstitutional, so it was not the competence of one just autonomy. So we don't have it anymore. That's the same as happened here.
Wow, interesting. Although Catalonia is kind of like an independent region of Spain, but this still applies, or?
It's not independent. We have like different regions. So each one has their autonomous government, but that kind of things or laws has to be from the central government.
Mhm.
And that was just like here.
Yeah, just like in Germany.
Yeah, there's one important difference that here, when the law was revoked, all the provisions of the law are no longer valid. So, I mean, if the rent was increased or decreased after the introduction of rent increase, then it must have been in the